Islam Muslims. First, I give praise to my Father God Allah. And I'd like to thank Him for His mercy and His patience. I give honors to all true and divine prophets of Allah. And I give honor to His holy prophet, Prophet Noble Drew Ali. And I give honor to all true and divine prophets of Allah, Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, Confucius, etc. I give honor to the forerunner of the prophet, Brother Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And I would like to extend honors to man. Before I proceed, I would like to take a reading from the Holy Quran of the Moorish Science Temple of America. And this reading will be coming from chapter 47, Egypt, the capital empire of the Dominion of Africa. And I will read it in its entirety. The inhabitants of Africa are the descendants of the ancient Canaanites from the land of Canaan. Old man Cush and his family are the first inhabitants of Africa who came from the land of Canaan. His father Ham and his family were second. Then came the word Ethiopia, which means which means the demarcation line of the dominion of Umexem, the first true and divine name of Africa, the dividing of the land between the father and the son. The dominion of Cush, northeast and southeast Africa, and northwest and southwest, was his father's dominion of Africa. In later years, many of their brethren from Asia and the Holy Lands joined them. The Moabites from the land of Moab, who received permission from the pharaohs of Egypt to settle and inhabit northwest Africa, they were the founders and are the true possessors of the present Moroccan Empire, with their Canaanite, Hittite, and Amorite brethren, who sojourned from the land of Canaan seeking new homes. Their dominion and inhabitation extended from northeast and southwest Africa, across the great Atlantis, even unto the present North, South, and Central America, and also Mexico and the Atlantis Islands, before the great earthquake, which caused the great Atlantic Ocean. The river Nile was dredged and made by the ancient pharaohs of Egypt in order to trade with the surrounding kingdoms. Also, the Niger River was dredged by the great pharaoh of Egypt in those ancient days for trade, and it extends eastward from the river Nile, westward across the great Atlantic. It was used for trade and transportation. According to all true and divine records of the human race, there is no Negro, black, or colored race attached to the human family, because all the inhabitants of Africa were and are of the human race, descendants of the ancient Canaanite nation from the Holy Land of Canaan. What your ancient forefathers were, you are today without doubt or contradiction. There is no one who is able to change man from the descendant nature of his forefathers, unless his power extends beyond the great universal creator Allah himself. These holy and divine laws are from the Prophet, Noble Drew Ali, the founder of the Uniting of the Moorish Science Temple of America. These laws are to be strictly preserved by the members of all the temples of the Moorish Science Temple of America, that they will learn to open their meeting and guide it according to the principles of love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice. Every subordinate temple of the Grand Major Temple is to form under the covenant of love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice, and to create their own laws and customs in conjunction with the laws of the Holy Prophet in the Grand Temple. I, the Prophet, Noble Drew Ali, was sent by the great God Allah to warn all Asiatics of America to repent from their sinful ways before that great and awful day that is sure to come. The time has come when every nation must worship under its own vine and fig tree, and every tongue must confess its own. Through sin and disobedience, every nation has suffered slavery due to the fact that they honored not the creed and principles of their forefathers. That is why the nationality of the Moors was taken away from them in 1774, and the word Negro, black, and color was given to the Asiatics of America who were of Moorish descent, because they honored not the creed and not the principles of their mother and father, and strayed after the gods of Europe of whom they knew nothing. Islam. And I would like to read a few questions from the 101 questionnaire. What year was the Moorish Science Temple of America founded? 1913 AD. Where? Newark, New Jersey. Where was Noble Drew Ali born? In the state of North Carolina, 1886. What is his nationality? Moorish American. What is your nationality? Moorish American. Why are we Moorish Americans? Because we are descendants of Moroccans and born in America. For what purpose was the Moorish Science Temple of America founded? For the uplifting of fallen humanity. How did the Prophet begin to uplift the Moorish American? By teaching them to be themselves. What is our religion? Islamism. Is that a new or is that the old time religion? Old time religion. What kind of a flag is the Moorish? It is a red flag with a 5-pointed green star in the center. What do the 5 points represent? Love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice. How old is our flag? It is over 10,000 years old. Islam. I was, since the last presentation and things that were discussed, I was looking into different things to try to, help gather some further understanding. And I was looking into what prompted this particular topic that I'm going to discuss was I was looking into being that some of the events that were occurring a few days ago and up to today, I believe, in Arkansas and other areas in the land, but Arkansas in particular. I was looking up some things about Arkansas, and then that unfolded into some other things that events over history that stood out to me, and I'd like to discuss now and see how they can correlate and have relation to some of the things that we experience in this day in time. And I'd like to discuss those now. Initially beginning out, it's a lot of things from 1666. And I have some times from things from different another time period, but one of the main time periods that I will be discussing today is from 1666. And I put on here some of the things, the events of 1666 that stood out, and I went into some research on a few of those, and I will discuss those now. One thing that stood out is January 17th, 1666. The chair of St. Peter, Cathedral Petri, designed by Bernini, is set above the altar in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And what stood out to me about that is, like set above and set above the altar, and some of the things that I've read in previous presentations about St. Peter and some of the papal bulls that were put out mentioning St. Peter. I didn't put a whole lot of information about that, but that stood out to me, and I wanted to put that here. But this is a major one that stood out to me. Is on April 20th, 1666. It says, in colonial British North America, quote-unquote, articles of peace and amity are signed between the governments of the province of Maryland and 12 eastern Algonquian tribes, the Piscataquis, Amacostanks, Doegs, Matawamans, Portobacs, Chapticos, Mickey-Wamans, Manaskasins, Chingwawetics, Hangamax, Sakayos, and Panyayos. But I'm going to go into some things about this. This says the Articles of Peace and Amity. And I went and found that, what stood out to me about this is, and I will go into detail on these things, is in colonial British North America, Articles of Peace and Amity, quote unquote, are signed between the governments of of the province of Maryland and 12 eastern Algonquian tribes. So I put the Articles of Peace and Amity here. I won't read through it because a lot of it is in Old English, but there is a summary of it, and from what I read through it, the summary is pretty good, and it speaks on some of the things that we're going to discuss. So, one thing that was discussed here or mentioned here is that proprietaries, and that means property or the owner of property. But I will read the summary that I found of it and go into some things. It says the treaty, and we're speaking of the Treaty of Peace and quote unquote Treaty of Peace and Amity. It says the treaty established the right of native peoples to remain on their lands and preserve their inviolable right to continue fishing, crabbing, hunting, and fowling. The treaty also stated that if an Indian kill an Englishman, he shall die for it. However, execution is only prescribed for English colonists if an Englishman shall kill any Indian that shall come unpainted. And that makes me think of anything that has been painted, stained, varnished, or dyed, colored. So only in their words or quote unquote agreement treaty is any Englishman, the English colonists, harm can only come to English colonists if an Englishman kill any Indian that shall come uncolored, unpainted, uncolored, painted, stained, varnished, or dyed. The treaty forbade native peoples from entering any colonial settlements while being painted, stating that the English cannot easily distinguish one Indian from another. If a native person and a colonist met accidentally in the forest, the Indian shall be bound immediately to throw down his arms upon call, and in case any Indian so meeting an Englishman shall refuse to throw down his arms upon call, he shall be deemed as an enemy. Okay, first thing I want to touch on is what I found interesting is the treaty established the right of native peoples to remain on their lands. And I'll go back up here quickly. The word remain was actually used in the document. Yeah, the emperor of the Piscataway to be and remain in the honorable caseless lord and proper of this province, and the heirs and his heirs, lords and proprietaries of his province. So remain, some of the things it says they can remain. Some of the things that stood out to me about remain is be left after the removal or loss of a part, number, or quality. Be left behind. And this stood out. It's from around the era of what we're discussing. Is also from early 15th century as continue in someone's charge or possession, continued in a certain place or condition, continue in a certain place or condition. So they can continue in someone's charge or possession, continue in a certain place or condition. They can be left behind. Now I did want to touch on something in here, in this quote-unquote treaty document. It said that the colonists can appoint an emperor, and that the quote-unquote emperor of the Piscataway is in the basically subjugated to the colonists. Arms. Did I put arms on here? I thought I did. Well, let's look it up, shall we? I could have swore I had it on here. It maybe got pushed down. Well, it's not working very well for me right there, so, but from what I remember, what I had is that arms can be tools or implements, and also like branches of an organization, so they were bound to throw down their arms, the tools, the implements, the makes me think of, the things that we're given as a nation to provide us with strength and guidance, and to assist us in prospering. But since this was signed with the Piscataway, I put some information on the Piscataway here. Okay, I'll read this because it's one of the main quote-unquote leaders that were a part of this treaty. And this is some information on the Piscataway. It says, by 1600, incursions by the Susquehanna and other Iroquois peoples from the north had almost entirely destroyed many of the Algonquian settlements above present-day Great Falls, Virginia, on the Potomac River. The villages below the fall line survived by banding together for the common defense. They gradually consolidated authority under hereditary chiefs who exacted tribute, sent men to war, and coordinated the resistance against northern incursions and rival claimants to the lands. A hierarchy of places and rulers emerged. Hamlets without hereditary rulers paid tribute to a nearby village. Its chief, or werowance, appointed a lesser king to each dependent settlement. Changes in social structure occurred and religious development exalted the hierarchy. By the end of the 16th century, each werowance on the north bank of the Potomac was subject to the paramount chief, the ruler of the Piscataway, known as the Tayac. The English explorer Captain John Smith first visited the upper Potomac River in 1608. He recorded the Piscataway by the name Moyans after their king's house, i.e. capital village or Tayak's residence, especially spelled Moyon, located at Accokeek Creek site at Piscataway Park. Closely associated with them were the Nacotchtank people and Acostans, who lived around present-day Washington, D.C., and the Doeg on the Virginia side of the river. Rivals and reluctant subjects of the Tayac hoped that the English newcomers would alter the balance of power in the region. In search of trading partners, particularly for furs, the Virginia Company and later Virginia Colony consistently allied with enemies of the settled Piscataway. Their entry into the dynamics began to shift regional power. By the early 1630s, the Tayaks hold over some of his subordinate Werowonces had weakened considerably. However, when the English began to colonize what is now Maryland in 1634, the Tayac Kitamakun managed to turn the newcomers into allies. He had come to power that year after his brother Wanas, the former Tayac, after killing his brother Wanas, the former Tayac. He granted the English a former Indian settlement, which they renamed St. Mary's City, after Queen Henrietta Marie, the wife of King Charles I. The Tayac intended the new colonial outpost to serve as a buffer against the Iroquois and Susquehannock incursion from the north. Kitamakun and his wife converted to Christianity in 1640 by their friendship with the English Jesuit missionary Father Andrew White, who also performed their marriage. Their only daughter, Mary Kitamakun, became a ward of the English governor and of his sister-in-law, colonist Margaret Brant, both of whom held power in St. Mary's City and saw to the girl's education, including learning English. Just quickly, as reading all this, it just makes me think of amalgamation and, as it's stated, befriending the colonists, quote unquote, befriending the colonists to go after other people of the land. At a young age, Mary Kitamakun married the much older English colonist Giles Brant, one of Margaret's brothers. After trying to claim Piscataway territory upon her father's death, the couple moved south across the Potomac to establish a trading post and live at Aquia Creek in present-day Stafford County, Virginia. They were said to have 3 or 4 children together. Brent married again in 1654, so his child bride may have died young. Benefits to the Piscataway in having the English as allies and buffers were short-lived. The Maryland colony was initially too weak to pose a significant threat. Once the English began to develop a stronger colony, they turned against the Piscataway. By 1668, the Western Shore Algonquian were confined to 2 reservations, one of the Wicomico River and the other on a portion of the Piscataway homeland. Refugees from dispossessed Algonquian nations merged with the Piscataway. Colonial authorities forced the Piscataway to permit the Susquehannock and Iroquois-speaking people to settle in their territory after having been defeated in 1675 by the Iroquois Confederacy, based in New York. The traditional enemies eventually came to open conflict in present-day Maryland. With the tribes at war, the Maryland colony expelled the Susquehannock after they had been attacked by the Piscataway. The Susquehannock suffered a devastating defeat. Making their way northward, the surviving Susquehannock joined forces with their former enemy, the Haudenosaunee, the five-nation Iroquois Confederacy. Together, the Iroquoian tribes returned repeatedly to attack the Piscataway. The English provided little help to their Piscataway allies. Rather than raise a militia to aid them, the Maryland colony continued to compete for control of Piscataway land. Piscataway fortunes declined as the English Maryland colony grew and prospered. They were especially adversely affected by epidemics of infectious disease, which decimated their population, as well as by intertribal and colonial warfare. Alright, so all of this went, as it stated, it spoke on the Potomac River and in the vicinity of what is called today Washington, D.C. So, and I've spoken on these couple things that I'm about to read now, and I will explain how I can see them fitting together. It says Washington, D.C., formerly the District of Columbia and commonly known as Washington or D.C., is the capital city and federal district of the United States. A locally elected mayor and 13-member council have governed the district since 1973, though Congress retains the power to overturn local laws. And, okay, so before I proceed quickly, as we've discussed in previous presentations, that the District of Columbia is a British colony. And it says a locally elected mayor and 13-member council have governed the district since 1973. And how we've spoken on, the DC residents have no voting authority and other things. And it says, okay, I'll read this here real quick and then I want to go back up top. It says a locally elected mayor and 13-member council have governed the district since 1973, though Congress retains the power to overturn local laws. So it says a locally elected mayor. Some of the etymological definitions of local pertaining to position. So, like, I see that as status also, and rank or standing in society. And also limited to a particular place, and how we mentioned that Washington, quote unquote, Washington D.C. residents have no voting authority. So locally elected mayor, one who has no voting authority, one pertaining to a certain position that is coincides with Washington D.C. It says a locally elected mayor and 13-member council. And as I was, putting all this together, that kept coming to my mind. I didn't have this on there, on here at the time, but the 13-member council kept, coming to my mind. And what it makes me think of is page 8. In colonial British North America, quote-unquote, Articles of Peace and Amity are signed between the governments of the Province of Maryland and 12 Eastern Algonquian tribes. So, 13-member council. And as it states in the treaty and in the summary, subjugated Washington, D.C. See how all that, is related. The 13-member council. So, I looked up some of the things about the 13-member council just to, try to formulate the thought further. It says the Council of the District of Columbia, or simply DC Council, is the legislative branch of the government of the District of Columbia. As permitted in the United States Constitution, the district is not part of any U.S. state and is overseen directly by the federal government. It had this as the seal. I noticed like this thing in his hand, it looks like a document wrapped up or something, like it could be a quote-unquote treaty of peace and amity. And it says it's the type of organization that it is unicameral. I will go over that in a second. Political groups: Democratic, 11 Democratic, 2 Independent. Unicameral, it says its type is unicameral. So it's unicameralism is a type of legislature consisting of one house or assembly that legislates and votes as one. It says there its authority is stemmed from the District of Columbia Home Rule Act. District of Columbia Home Rule Act is a United States federal law passed on December 24th, 1973, which devolved certain congressional powers of the District of Columbia to local government, furthering District of Columbia Home Rule. In particular, it includes the District Charter, also called the Home Rule Charter, which provides for an elected mayor and the Council of the District of Columbia. As it said, a locally elected mayor and 13-member council. The council is composed of a chair elected at large and 12 members, 4 of whom are elected at large and 1 from each of the district's 8 wards. Council members are elected to 4-year terms. So it says elected at large. What stood out to me with at large? At large is a description for members of a governing body who are elected or appointed to represent a whole membership or population, notably a city, country, state, province, nation, club, or association. So, rather than a subset. So how I'm looking at that is that 13-member quote-unquote peace and amity treaty is like the quote-unquote document, one of the quote-unquote documents in which the people who were placed into the as quote-unquote residents of Washington, D.C., or the District of Columbia, a British colony, it is what uses to govern and legislate the people as a whole. Like it tied all the people into that as a whole. So as it's stated in there, the putting down the arms and how, or they're bound to put down their arms, and how there's no the residents of Washington, quote unquote, Washington, D.C., have no voting authority. So, like, lumping all the people into the status which was, quote unquote, created from the 1606 Treaty of Peace and Amity, quote unquote. I put Hindu on here because, you know, as it's discussing Indians over and over, you know, and Hindus are, even though it's spelled with two O's, I believe it's the round about the same word. Hindu, you know, means Indian, so the Hindus and followers of Buddha. Oh, yeah, arms. It was down here. Tools, implements, that which is fitted together. So bound to put down their tools, implements, that which is fitted together, branch of any organization. Another, and this is from 1666 as well, the same year of the quote unquote Treaty of Peace and Amity, quote unquote. September 4th, 1666, Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb grants the French East Indian Company a royal mandate to trade at the port of Surat. And I looked up Surat to see a little bit about it, and you know, one of the main things that stood out is the nickname of Surat is Diamond City. You know, and it makes me think of, you know, the precious stones that are spoken of, and unbreakable and flexible, you know, so to give one access to, you know, precious parts of what makes you a people thrive and strong. That's what that made me think of. And this was very interesting. It stood out to me. And I had heard of the Sesta QV Act and the Sesta QV quote unquote trust before, years ago. And I had I guess, a little different mind state about it. I didn't know for sure, you know, I had a little different mind state about it before, but, you know, from what I read on it this time, you know, and what I'm about to go over, gave me a better perception of it, to be able to see it a little about the implements of it and the schemes of it a little more. So we just spoke on the Treaty of Peace and Amity and the things that were involved in that. And in this same year, September 6, 1666, the Sesta QV Act is passed by the Parliament of England to provide for the disposal of the property of missing persons. And this emblem was there to represent the English UK and I have a little more on that later. But to continue, the Sesta QV Act of 1666 by the Parliament of England, and the long title of it is An Act for Redress of Inconvenience by Want of Proof of the Deceases of persons beyond the seas, or absenting themselves, upon whose lives estates do depend. So that makes me think of the painted, unpainted that was mentioned, and beyond the seas, you know, It makes me think of, across the sea in the physical form, as well as, like maritime law. And it says, so they're talking about people upon whose lives estates do depend. So if, and this is, just me brainstorming about it, is, you know, if those quote unquote people whose lives estates do depend are dependent on, the estate is dependent on the life, or the living of said people, then this is implemented to quote, basically take the inheritance of those people, the estate of those people, as your own. That's what I gathered from it. By placing them in a quote unquote dead status. I have it's not a lot, but I have, well, it's not too much. I guess I can read that. It says, let me go back. It says, prior to 2013, English law generally assumed a person was dead if, after 7 years, there was no evidence that they were still alive, or the people who most likely to have heard from them had no contact, or inquiries made of that person had no, so they could have granted probate for the will. This kind of application would only have to have been made sooner than 7 years where death was probable, but not definitive, such as an unrecovered plane crash at sea following an inquest. And that's like has to do with like a court inquiry, if I'm not mistaken. Such an application was specific to the court where it was made. Thus, separate applications had to be made at a coroner's inquest for proceedings under the matrimonial clauses and civil partnership acts for remarriage, for probate, and under the probate and under the Social Security Act. And I thought, interesting how matrimony and partnership had something to do with it. Go back up quickly. In the same year, June 6th, 1666, Moulay al-Rashid is led into Fez by the city's Jews, establishing the power of Morocco's Alawi dynasty, which will continue into the 21st century. And if I'm not mistaken, that is the same ones that, in what is referred to as the Kingdom of Morocco in this time is still the Alawi dynasty, quote unquote Alawi dynasty, who has that position. And I found this interesting. This is the seal that was for England, or the UK, the British in England, and the basically emblem for the Alawi dynasty, how it had a lot of similarities, like this lion looking out. There's a lot of similarities with it. And, all the things that were implemented of stealing, or, stealing estates and inheritances and things of that nature. But I have a lot here about the Alawi. I won't read all of it. I'll read some of it, some of the things that stood out. The Alawi dynasty Alawite, is the current Moroccan royal family and reigning dynasty. They are an Arab Sharifian dynasty and claim descent from the Islamic prophet Muhammad through his grandson Hassan ibn Ali. Their ancestors originally migrated to the, I don't know how to say that, Taflate, and I think that means like Oasis region. Taflati region in present day Morocco from Yanbu on the coast of the Hijaz in the 12th or 13th century. So they're an Arab Sharifian dynasty and claim descent from the Islamic prophet Muhammad. It says the family's rise to power took place in the context of early to mid 17th century, and that's what we're discussing, 1666. That's mid 17th century. So it took place in the context of early to mid 17th century Morocco, when the power of the Saudi sultans of Marrakesh was in serious decline and multiple regional factions fought for control of the country. There's a lot here. But one of the main things I wanted to discuss about the Alawis, besides, the emblems favoring each other and the timing of this and law governing all events, etc., is that it said they are Sharifian. They are an Arab Sharifian dynasty and claim descent from the Islamic prophet Muhammad. So, Sharifism was the system in pre-colonial Morocco in which the Sharifa, descendants of the Islamic prophet Muhammad through his grandson Hassan ibn Ali, in the case of Morocco, held a privileged religious and political position in society. And this stood out a lot to me. Those who claimed this lineage were regarded as a kind of nobility and were privileged, in the words of Sahar Bazaz, as political agents, as interlocutors between various sectors of society, and as would-be dynasts of Morocco. They were additionally believed to possess baraka, or blessing power. Claiming this lineage also served to justify authority. So it said they were additionally believed to possess baraka. In Islam, baraka, blessing, is a blessing power, a kind of continuity of spiritual presence and revelation that begins with God and flows through that and those closest to God. The Quran is said to be charged with baraka, and God can bestow prophets and saints with baraka, especially Muhammad and his descendants are said to be especially endowed with it. These special people can transfer their baraka to ordinary people, both while being dead or alive. Makes me think of the Prophet, and the true possessors of the Moroccan Empire as well. Sacred places are said to contain baraka and ward off evil spiritual forces. Thus, monasteries and Sufi temples are often visited for protection against demonic beings. And this stood out. As a blessing force, baraka is also a force of creation and fertility, causing cereals to miraculously multiply. And that makes me think of propagating, as it states in Our Authority, this is a paraphrase, propagating the faith, anointing, appoint, consecrating missionaries, etc. the faith of Muhammad. It says a force of creation and fertility causing cereals to miraculously multiply. Cereal, grass yielding edible grain and cultivated for food, having to do with edible grain. Serious, serious, to grow. Um, so, and this will come into play shortly again in the presentation as well. But that made me think of the Quran, Quran, and Surah 33:40. It says, Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, but is the messenger of Allah and the seal of the prophets, and Allah has perfect knowledge of all things. And it makes me think of, the seal of the prophets, a force of creation and fertility causing cereals to miraculously multiply, propagating the faith, telling the true tree by the fruit it bears. And it makes me also think of what we've discussed in previous presentations is the impression seal. The impression, the bringing forth, causing cereals to miraculously multiply is the seal of the prophets. And as we're discussing from, people being descendants of Prophet Muhammad, and also makes me think once again of our authority. While I'm on it, I want to so yeah, this is also in 1666, July 6th on 3 Muharram 1077 AH on the Muslim calendar. Sa'ad ibn Zayd, a descendant of Hassan ibn Ali and of Muhammad, founder of Islam, becomes the new Sharif of Mecca in modern-day Saudi Arabia. His ascension to the post follows the death of his father, Zayd ibn Musin, who had been the Sharif since 1631. Okay, so to continue, I'm going to explain how what we were just speaking of on the grain and the causing cereals to miraculously multiply, the baraka that is possessed by those who are descendants of prophets of Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, or true and divine prophets of Allah. So this is what initially got me onto this topic. So I will discuss this shortly, and this is about some of those who inhabited the area of Arkansas, what is called Arkansas at this time, and makes me think of and those who were living up and down the Mississippi River. And it is stated that I'm paraphrasing, but it is stated that the prophet said, the Moors were living up and down the Mississippi River before the European man came here. So I will read this, and as I stated, I see as it ties into what we were just discussing with the baraka and the cereals to miraculously multiply, oppression seals. In April 1542, Spanish soldiers, so this is 1542, so 124 years before what we were just discussing, but this is very interesting. It says, in April 1542, Spanish soldiers encamped along the Mississippi River with Hernando de Soto first heard the name Quigotam. According, first heard the name Quigotam. According to Indians living near the mouth of the Arkansas River, Quigotam was a powerful nation led by a chief of the same name who controlled the great river a short distance to the south. For reasons outlined in the story that follows, the Spaniards would never meet Chief Quigotam, nor would they set eyes on his citadel, but they would soon come to fear and respect his power. Okay. It says, before European settlement of North America, Arkansas was inhabited by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. The Caddo, Osage, and Quapaw peoples encountered European explorers. The first of these Europeans was Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto in 1541, who crossed the Mississippi and marched across central Arkansas and the Ozark Mountains. After finding nothing he considered of value and encountering native resistance the entire way, he and his men returned to the Mississippi River, where De Soto fell ill. From his deathbed, he ordered his men to massacre all the men of the nearby village of Anico, who he feared had been plotting with a powerful polity down the Mississippi River. And a polity, like a organized governmental group of people, a nation with a powerful polity down the Mississippi River, Quigotam. His men obeyed and did not stop with the men, but were said to have massacred women and children as well. He died the following day in what is believed to be the vicinity of modern-day MacArthur, Arkansas, in May 1542. His body was weighted down with sand, and he was consigned to a watery grave in the Mississippi River under cover of darkness by his men. De Soto had attempted to deceive the native population into thinking he was an immortal deity, son of the sun, in order to forestall attack by outraged Native Americans on his by then weakened and bedraggled army. In order to keep the ruse up, his men informed the locals that De Soto had ascended into the sky. His will at the time of his death listed 4 Indian slaves, 3 horses, and 700 hogs, which were auctioned off. The starving men, who had been living off maize stolen from natives, immediately started butchering the hogs, and later, commanded by former aide-de-camp Moscoso, attempted an overland return to Mexico. They made it as far as Texas before running into territory too dry for maize farming and too thinly populated to sustain themselves by stealing food from the locals. The expedition promptly backtracked to Arkansas. After building a small fleet of boats, they then headed down the Mississippi River and eventually on to Mexico by water. So, and this was in 1541, right? And as it states later down here, I'm about to get into that, 1673, French explorers Father Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet, however you say it, reached the headwaters of the Mississippi River and descend to Arkansas. So throughout that all that time, they weren't able to, quote, as it's stated in history, weren't able to infiltrate this part of North America because of the resistance of the people of the land, as we were just discussing, in 1673. Later explorers include the French Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet in 1673, and Robert La Salle and Henry de Tonty in 1681. So this is continuing from the 1541 period. It says it was another 150 years before another European group recorded the Tunica In 1699, when encountered by the La Source expedition coming down river from Canada, the Tunica were a modest-sized tribe numbering only a few hundred warriors, with about 900 people in total. While the Spanish had been in their territory only for a short time, their encounter had devastating effects. The accidental introduction of Eurasian infectious diseases, such as smallpox, ravaged the native populations, who had no acquired immunity. In addition, the expedition had played off local political rivalries, causing more conflict. And this is reiterating this, after the Kigotam, the ruler and the people at that time had pushed them back. It says no further recorded European contact with the indigenous people in this area occurred for almost 140 years until the first French explorers reached the area in the 1680s. By the historic period, power had shifted within the Natchez polity from Emerald Mound, which had to do with Kigotam, and the Plaquemine, which we will discuss in a second, to the grand village of the Natchez, and the glass site had also been abandoned, because it caused diseases when De Soto and his men came 140 years prior. So disease, and I look at that as also not just like sickness as what is commonly known, but also ways of thinking, different ways of life through the carnal thoughts that bring us down spread also. The teachings of European colonists. In the meantime, native peoples of the region suffered from epidemics of infectious diseases. They contracted these from members of the De Soto expedition, among whom the diseases were endemic, and indirectly from other Native Americans who had contact with European traders on the Gulf Coast. The Spaniards' technique of using local rivalries to their advantage had upset the delicate political balance between native groups, who had existed in a state of low-level endemic warfare between polities for generations. In addition, a series of disastrous multi-year droughts spanned the latter half of the 16th century. Many societies in the region began to collapse. Remnant populations of Mississippian peoples began migrating across and down the Mississippi, sometimes settling in areas recently deserted by the Plaquemine peoples, and at other times displacing or merging with the Plaquemine population on the lower river. The Plaquemine culture contracted southward and abandoned the northern Natchez Bluffs altogether. The lower Yazoo Basin region, once occupied by the Winterville and Holly Bluff polity, became the territory of the historic period Yazoo, Tunica, and Corolla tribes. And that makes me think of, what we were discussing in previous videos, the Karawa of the quote-unquote Galveston area and the happenings with that. They had migrated from further upriver, thought by archaeologists to be the descendants of Quizquiz and other polities encountered by De Soto in the Memphis area, who were escaping the destruction of their societies left in De Soto's wake. So the internal issues that ones had prior to De Soto, and then being furthered by De Soto and his expedition in 140 years in between that time and this time that we're speaking of, all the things that were fomented and bred to further the weakening of the people of the land. But this is where, things come together from what we were discussing earlier. The Plaquemine. I looked up the etymology of Plaquemine, and it says, parish at the mouth of the Mississippi in Louisiana. From Louisiana, French, literally persimmon, right? Persimmon, what is a persimmon? Persimmon, North American date plum, a tree common in the U.S. Fruit dried artificially. He dries fruit berry. And so I looked more into persimmon because I felt like, he was meaning something and something was possibly behind it. It says, what is the Native American word for persimmon? It says Diospyros. Comes from the Greek words dios, divine, and pyros, wheat or grain. And together they translate to divine fruit or fruit of the gods or divine grain. Which makes me think of what we were discussing earlier with the Baraka. It says, as a blessing force, Baraka is also a force of creation and fertility, causing cereals to miraculously multiply. So these were the people, who were the relation to the true and divine prophets. And, I broke Plaquemine down to see if there's anything behind that as well, and placard, came out of plaque. And what stood out is written or printed paper displaying some proclamation or announcement intended to be posted in a public place to attract attention. That makes me think of, as the prophet stated, it's a new era time, and men must proclaim their nationality, and we are to display love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice. Many different things, but to proclaim, that stood out. And placard, formal document authenticated by a fixed seal, and a fixed seal, what we were discussing earlier. Propagating the faith, etc. Impression sealed. Teachings of the true and divine prophet. Propagating. So, yes. To that pretty quicker than I thought. But yes, found these things very interesting and related in a lot of different ways, especially with the 13-member council, the treaty of, quote unquote, treaty of peace and amity, and the Alawis at the same time. And the Sesta QV coming at the same time. And what I've learned from the prophet and about us as a people, it stands out. So I see it as, very important things, and I was, pleased and excited and grateful to receive the understanding of these things and to become aware of them. I will continue to study self. Look forward to speaking with you again. And I say peace to everyone. Peace.